Jamal, a young boy whose small act of kindness toward a struggling elderly man sets off a chain reaction that changes his life and his entire neighborhood in ways he could never have imagined. When a mysterious black car pulls up in front of his house, it's the beginning of a journey filled with unexpected challenges, whispers of suspicion, and a gift that holds the power to transform everything. But how does Jamal navigate the tensions in his community? And what will he and his family do when faced with a choice that could alter their future forever? Stick around to uncover this heartwarming tale of resilience, unity, and the power of one good deed. If you enjoy stories about hope and transformation, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. Let us know in the comments what you think of Jamal's journey, and share your own stories of kindness and connection. Now let's dive in. Jamal Carter sat on the front steps of his house, his legs stretched out over the cracked concrete. The late summer sun bore down on the neighborhood, casting long shadows across the narrow streets. Kids were playing 2 blocks over, their shouts carrying faintly through the air, but Jamal wasn't in the mood to join them today. He bounced a battered basketball against the step, the rhythmic thud giving him something to focus on. At 13, Jamal already felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. His wiry frame hinted at how active he was, constantly on the move to help his family. Though his friends teased him for being all bones, Jamal's quick reflexes and determined nature were his quiet strengths. The basketball slipped out of his hands and rolled into the dirt, but Jamal didn't bother retrieving it. He wiped the sweat off his brow with the sleeve of his too small t-shirt, its faded blue fabric clinging to his skin. Behind him, the front door creaked open, and his little brother, Emmett, poked his head out. "Jamal, Mama says come inside." Emmett's voice was high-pitched, and there was a slight wobble in it. Jamal sighed, knowing what that tone meant. "I'm coming," he called back, standing and brushing the dust from his shorts. Inside the house, the air was stuffy and hot. A rickety fan sat in the corner of the living room, oscillating uselessly as it pushed the heat from one side of the room to the other. His youngest sibling, Sophia, was sprawled on the floor near the fan, trying to stay cool. Her crayons were scattered across the carpet, a half-colored drawing of a house in front of her. Lydia Carter, their mother, was at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers. She looked up when Jamal entered, her tired eyes softening slightly. "Baby, can you run to the corner store for me? I need some flour and sugar." "Just enough for the week," she said, her voice low and weary. Jamal nodded, already reaching for the grocery list and the crumpled dollar bills she was holding out. He didn't miss the way her hands shook slightly as she handed them over. "Everything okay, Ma?" he asked hesitantly. Lydia smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's fine, baby. Just go on before it gets dark." Jamal knew better than to push. He stuffed the money into his pocket and grabbed the canvas bag hanging by the door. The corner store was a 10-minute walk, but Jamal took his time, kicking a loose rock down the sidewalk as he went. The neighborhood was familiar, even comforting in its shabbiness. Rows of houses lined the street, their paint peeling and porches sagging. People sat outside on their stoops, chatting in low voices or simply watching the world go by. "Jamal," called Mrs. Henderson from across the street. She was leaning against her front gate, a cigarette dangling from her lips. "Hey, Mrs. Henderson," Jamal replied, waving. "You tell your mama I said hi, okay?" "Yes, ma'am." The corner store came into view, its neon sign flickering. Inside, Mr. Patel stood behind the counter, ringing up a young woman's groceries. He glanced up when Jamal entered and gave him a small nod. "Afternoon, Jamal. Here to help your mama again?" "Yeah," Jamal said, heading to the back of the store to grab the flour and sugar. He added a carton of eggs to the mix, knowing Lydia would make them stretch over the week. At the counter, Mr. Patel rang up the items and slid a candy bar across the counter as he packed the bag. "For Sophia," he said with a wink. Jamal hesitated, then pocketed the candy. "Thanks, Mr. Patel. Tell your mama I said hello." Back home, the mood was heavier than before. Lydia was still at the table, her brow furrowed as she flipped through a stack of papers. "Rent's late again," she muttered under her breath, barely noticing Jamal as he set the groceries down on the counter. Emmett and Sophia were arguing over the crayons when Jamal knelt beside them. "Hey, cut it out," he said, pulling the candy bar from his pocket. "Sophia, this is for you." But you gotta share, okay? Sophia's eyes lit up, and Emmett immediately stopped whining at the sight of the chocolate. Jamal ruffled their hair before standing and turning his attention back to the kitchen. "What's going on, Ma?" he asked, his voice low. Lydia sighed, rubbing her temples. "Mr. Murdoch came by earlier. Gave us a week to pay, or..." She trailed off, but Jamal didn't need her to finish. He'd seen the eviction notices before. The knock on the door came the next afternoon, sharp and insistent. Lydia stiffened at the sound, her eyes darting toward Jamal. "Get the door, baby," she said quietly. Jamal nodded, his stomach tightening as he approached. Peeking through the curtain, he saw Mr. Murdoch standing on the porch, his usual frown etched deep into his face. "Your mama Holmes?" Murdoch asked when Jamal opened the door. "Yes, sir," Jamal replied, stepping aside to let him in. Lydia came to the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Murdoch," she said, her tone polite but strained. "You know why I'm here?" he said. "I do," Lydia said, "and I just need a little more time. I'm expecting something soon. I can get you the money by next week." Murdoch sighed, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. "You've got until Friday. No more extensions, Lydia. I'm running a business here." Jamal clenched his fists at the way Murdoch spoke, but he kept quiet. When the door finally shut behind the landlord, the tension in the room didn't dissipate. That evening, Jamal went to the empty lot where he and his friends usually played soccer. The deflated ball didn't bother them. They'd been kicking it around for years. Malik, Jamal's best friend, was already there, juggling the ball with his knees. "You're late," Malik teased, tossing the ball to Jamal. "Had stuff to do," Jamal replied, dribbling the ball across the dirt. The game was a welcome distraction, but as the sun began to set, something caught Jamal's eye. Across the street, an elderly man struggled to lift a large wooden box into the trunk of a sleek black car. His frail frame bent under the weight, and Jamal's heart tugged. "Be right back," he called to Malik, jogging toward the man. "Hey, mister," Jamal said. "Need a hand?" The old man looked up, surprised, before a grateful smile spread across his face. "That would be wonderful, son. Thank you." The box was heavier than Jamal expected, but he managed to hoist it into the trunk with the man's help. When they finished, the man placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder. "You're a good kid," he said. Not many would stop to help. Jamal shrugged, feeling embarrassed. "It's nothing." The old man chuckled softly before climbing into the car. As it drove away, its taillights fading into the distance, Jamal felt a strange sense of pride. The next day, the sleek black car reappeared, but this time, it was parked in front of Jamal's house. Jamal froze on the sidewalk, his grocery bag slipping slightly from his grasp. The driver's door opened, and a well-dressed man stepped out. He was younger than the man Jamal had helped, with sharp features and an air of authority. "You must be Jamal Carter," the man said, offering a hand. "I'm Connor Hargrove. My father told me about you." Jamal shook his hand cautiously. "Oh." Connor smiled. "He wanted me to thank you personally. My father doesn't forget kindness like that." "Tell him it's no big deal," Jamal said quickly, already feeling uncomfortable. "Actually, he'd like to thank you in person," Connor continued. "Would you and your family be willing to visit our home? It would mean a lot to him." Jamal hesitated, glancing at the house. "I don't know. I'd have to ask my mom." "Of course," Connor said, handing him a sleek business card. "Please let her know we'd be happy to host you. My father's a bit old-fashioned. He believes in gratitude." As the car drove away, Jamal stared at the card in his hand, the weight of the gesture sinking in. Jamal handed the sleek black business card to his mom later that evening. Lydia stared at it for a long moment, turning it over in her hand. The card was pristine, the name Connor Hargrove printed in elegant lettering with a phone number below. "And he just gave this to you?" Lydia asked, her tone skeptical. Jamal nodded, sitting at the kitchen table. "He said his dad wanted to thank me, for helping him with that box." Lydia exhaled deeply, setting the card down. "I don't know, Jamal. People like that don't usually come around here unless they want something. They don't seem like bad people, Ma," Jamal said hesitantly. "The old man seemed nice. And the son, Connor, he said it was just to show gratitude." Lydia's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll think about it." The next day, Lydia called Connor Hargrove, her tone measured and polite as she arranged a time for their visit. Jamal could hear the tension in her voice, the way she carefully chose her words. When she hung up, she sighed heavily. "We'll go," she said, "but we won't stay long." Jamal nodded, sensing her unease but also feeling a spark of curiosity. The Hargrove estate was unlike anything Jamal had ever seen. As Connor drove them through the gates in the same sleek black car, Jamal marveled at the sprawling lawns and towering oak trees. The driveway seemed to stretch forever, lined with neatly trimmed hedges. "Is this his house?" Emmett whispered, his nose pressed against the car window. "This is his property," Lydia corrected softly, her voice tinged with awe. When the mansion came into view, even Lydia couldn't hide her surprise. The house was massive, its white columns gleaming in the sunlight. It looked like something out of a magazine, the kind Jamal had flipped through at the library. Connor opened the car door for them and gestured toward the entrance. "Please come in. My father's waiting for you." The interior of the house was just as impressive as the outside. The floors were polished wood, and the ceilings soared high, adorned with intricate chandeliers. Lydia gripped Sophia's hand tightly, as if afraid her youngest child might accidentally knock something over. An elderly butler greeted them at the door, leading them into a sitting room where Walter Hargrove waited. The old man looked even frielier than Jamal remembered, his thin frame almost swallowed by the armchair he sat in. But his face lit up when he saw Jamal. "There he is," Walter said, his voice warm. "My young hero." Jamal shuffled awkwardly, his cheeks burning. "I just helped you with a box, sir." Walter chuckled. "That's more than most people would have done. Sit, please." They sat on a plush couch, Lydia's posture stiff and wary. Walter gestured toward a small tray of snacks and drinks on the coffee table. "Help yourselves," he said. Jamal reached for a cookie, encouraged by Walter's friendly smile, but Lydia declined, her hands resting tightly in her lap. "We're grateful for your hospitality, Mr. Hargrove," Lydia said, her tone polite but cautious. "But we don't want to impose." "Nonsense," Walter replied. "Your son's kindness meant more to me than you know, and I wanted to thank him and your whole family properly." He nodded toward Connor, who stepped forward holding an envelope. Walter gestured for Jamal to take it. Jamal hesitated, looking at Lydia for guidance. She gave him a slight nod, though her jaw tightened. Inside the envelope was a stack of crisp bills. Jamal's eyes widened, and he quickly handed it to Lydia. "Mr. Hargrove, this is very generous," but Lydia began, her voice faltering. Walter held up a hand. "Please, it's the least I can do. You're raising a fine young man, Miss Carter, and I want to help in any way I can." Lydia stared at the money for a long moment before carefully tucking it back into the envelope. "Thank you," she said quietly. As they prepared to leave, Jamal lingered in the hallway, his gaze drawn to a door slightly ajar. Inside, he glimpsed a room filled with ornate furniture, paintings, and sculptures. Everything looked old and expensive, the kind of stuff Jamal had only ever seen in museums. "Curious, aren't you?" Connor's voice made Jamal jump. Sorry," Jamal mumbled, stepping back. Connor smiled faintly. "That's just some of my father's collection. Family heirlooms, mostly. He's very sentimental about them." Jamal nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. The ride home was quiet. Emmett and Sophia dozed off in the back seat, their heads resting against each other. Lydia sat stiffly in the passenger seat, her hands gripping the envelope as if it might vanish. When they pulled up to their house, Lydia turned to Jamal. "Go inside with your siblings. I'll be in soon." Jamal obeyed, though he glanced back at her as she sat alone in the car, staring at the envelope. That night, as they ate a simple dinner of rice and beans, Lydia spoke up. "We'll use the money to pay the rent," she said firmly, "and maybe fix a few things around here. But I don't want anyone in this neighborhood knowing about it. Understood?" Jamal nodded. "Yes, Ma." Emmett and Sophia, too young to fully grasp the weight of the conversation, simply nodded along. Lydia's gaze softened as she looked at her children. "I just want us to have a little peace," she said quietly. "That's all." The next morning, Jamal woke early to find Lydia sitting at the kitchen table, a notebook and pen in front of her. She was making a list: rent, groceries, repairs, each item carefully written with neat precision. "Morning, baby," she said without looking up. "Morning, Ma," Jamal replied, pouring himself a glass of water. "Thank you," Lydia said suddenly, her voice soft. "For what?" Jamal asked, surprised. "For being you," she said simply, her eyes meeting his. Jamal smiled, the warmth of her words settling over him. For the first time in months, there was a sense of relief in the Carter household. The envelope of money Walter Hardgrove had given them wasn't just a gift, it was a lifeline. Lydia paid off their overdue rent immediately, ensuring Mr. Murdoch wouldn't be back with more threats. She also bought paint to brighten the dull, faded walls inside their home and scheduled a repairman to patch the leaky roof. Jamal watched the changes unfold with a mix of pride and unease. The money brought a measure of peace to his mom's usually furrowed brow, but it also made him feel like they were walking a fine line. His mother had made it clear they wouldn't rely on anyone else for their survival, but he couldn't ignore how much this help had already done. On Saturday morning, Jamal stood outside with a roller in hand, spreading fresh paint over the weathered siding of their house. Malik wandered over, his hands shoved in his pockets. "Yo, Jamal, your place is looking nice," Malik said, kicking at a loose stone on the sidewalk. "What's up with that?" Jamal shrugged, focusing on the paint. "Just trying to fix it up. Mom said it was time." "Yeah, but how?" Malik pressed, narrowing his eyes. "Y'all win the lottery or something?" Jamal hesitated. "Nah, just got some help." Malik's curiosity deepened. "From who?" Jamal shook his head, brushing him off. "It's nothing, Malik. Let it go." But Malik didn't let it go. That afternoon, when Jamal walked to the corner store, Malik tagged along, peppering him with questions. "I don't get it, man. You've been doing all right, but now you're fixing the roof, painting the house. What gives?" "Drop it," Jamal said firmly, stepping inside the store. The whispers in the neighborhood started soon after. Mrs. Henderson mentioned the new paint job to Mr. Patel, who casually brought it up to another neighbor. It wasn't long before the entire block was talking about how the Carters were suddenly improving their home. Jamal could feel the change when he walked down the street. People lingered longer on their porches, their eyes following him as he passed. Some offered polite nods or hesitant smiles, but others turned away, their expressions tight. "You see Mrs. Hill looking at us?" Emmett asked one day as they walked home from school. Jamal glanced across the street. Mrs. Hill stood on her porch, watering her plants, but her gaze was fixed on them. "She's just nosy," Jamal said, trying to reassure his brother. But inside, he couldn't shake the growing discomfort. Despite the improvements at home, trouble wasn't far behind. A week after Lydia paid the rent, Mr. Murdoch stopped by unexpectedly. He knocked sharply on the door, his usual scowl in place. "What now?" Lydia muttered as she opened the door. Murdoch handed her an envelope without saying a word. Lydia opened it, her face tightening as she read the notice inside. "What is it, Ma?" Jamal asked, stepping closer. "Rent increase," Lydia said through clenched teeth. "Starting next month." Jamal's stomach dropped. "Can he even do that?" "He can," Lydia said bitterly. "And he knows we can't fight it." The increase wasn't massive, but it was enough to undo the fragile stability they'd gained. Lydia spent the next few days reworking her budget, cutting out anything non-essential. The repairs to the house would have to wait, and groceries would be stretched even thinner. Jamal couldn't ignore the sense of helplessness creeping back in. He spent more time outside, playing soccer with Malik or helping neighbors with small errands to distract himself. But even as he tried to focus on the present, the shadow of their financial struggles loomed over him. One evening, as Jamal sat on the porch, Connor Hargrove's sleek black car pulled up to the curb. Jamal tensed, glancing inside the house. Lydia was in the kitchen, and he knew she wouldn't be happy about Connor's unexpected visit. "Evening, Jamal," Connor said, stepping out of the car. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "No, it's fine," Jamal said, though his tone wasn't convincing. Connor studied him for a moment before speaking. "My father's been asking about you. He's not doing well, but he remembers you fondly. He wanted me to see how you and your family were doing." Jamal shifted uncomfortably. "We're doing okay." Connor nodded. "Good. If you ever need anything, you know where to find us." Before Jamal could respond, Lydia appeared at the door, her expression tight. Everything all right out here? Connor offered her a polite smile. Just checking in, Ms. Carter. My father's fond of your son, and we wanted to make sure you were all right. We're fine, Lydia said curtly. Thank you for stopping by. Connor hesitated, his gaze flicking to Jamal. Take care, then. He climbed back into the car, and Jamal watched as it disappeared down the street. Later that night, Lydia pulled Jamal aside. I told you to stay away from them, she said, her voice low but firm. I didn't ask him to come, Ma, Jamal said defensively. He just showed up. Lydia sighed, rubbing her temples. They're not part of our world, Jamal. People like that don't just give, they expect something in return. And we can't afford to owe them. I get it, Ma, Jamal said quietly. But deep down, he wasn't sure he could fully agree. The tension in the Carter household grew as Lydia tightened their budget to accommodate the rent increase. Meals became simpler, and Emmett and Sophia learned not to ask for extras. Jamal took on more small jobs around the neighborhood, helping Mr. Green clean his yard and delivering groceries for Mrs. Henderson. But even as they scraped by, the whispers in the neighborhood persisted. Some neighbors congratulated the Carters on their efforts to improve their home, while others speculated about where the money was coming from. They've got connections, someone muttered to Mr. Patel one afternoon. That's why they're fixing up so fast. Connections? Like who? I heard about a fancy car coming by their house. Don't tell me that's normal. One afternoon, Jamal found Malik waiting for him at the empty lot where they usually played soccer. You okay, me? Malik asked as they kicked the ball back and forth. Yeah, Jamal said, though his tone betrayed him. Come on, Jamal. Spill it. You've been acting weird. Jamal hesitated, then sighed. It's just things at home. People talking, money being tight. It's a lot. Malik nodded. Yeah, I get it. But people are always going to talk. You just got to do your thing, you know? Jamal smiled faintly. Yeah, maybe. That evening, as Jamal sat on the porch, he saw Mrs. Henderson approaching with a grocery cart. She waved, her smile warm as she stopped at the gate. Evening, Jamal, she said. Your place is looking nice. Your mama must be proud. Thanks, Mrs. Henderson, Jamal said, his chest swelling slightly with pride. She patted his arm. You tell her she's doing a great job. All right? Jamal nodded, watching as she continued down the street. Her kind words lingered, a small reminder that not everyone was suspicious. 2 weeks after Connor Hargrove's unexpected visit, the strain in the Carter household was beginning to show. The fresh paint and repaired roof hadn't gone unnoticed by the neighborhood, but instead of bringing pride, the changes brought questions. Whispers turned into pointed stares, and Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched every time he stepped outside. One afternoon, as Jamal walked home from the corner store, he spotted Mrs. Hill standing on her porch with a group of neighbors. Their conversation quieted as he passed, their eyes following him until he turned the corner. When he got home, Emmett and Sophia were playing quietly in the living room, a stark contrast to their usual lively antics. Jamal set the groceries on the counter and found Lydia sitting at the kitchen table, her fingers drumming against the wood. Ma, you okay? Jamal asked, unpacking the groceries. Lydia looked up, her expression weary. I ran into Mrs. Hill earlier. She asked me where we got the money to fix the roof. Jamal froze, the bag of rice slipping from his hand onto the counter. What did you say? I told her it was none of her business, Lydia said firmly, but her voice wavered. But Jamal, people are talking, and I don't like the way they're looking at us. It's just jealousy, Jamal muttered, but even as he said it, he felt a pang of doubt. Lydia sighed, leaning back in her chair. Jealousy or not, we can't afford to draw attention. This neighborhood, it's not kind of people who seem like they're getting ahead. Jamal swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had never thought of their small improvements as a threat, but now he wondered if their success was painting a target on their backs. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jamal sat on the porch, his thoughts swirling. The warm breeze carried the distant sound of kids playing, but the usual comfort of the neighborhood felt absent. Malik appeared out of nowhere, plopping down beside him. Yo, what's up with you lately? Jamal shrugged. Nothing. Come on, man. I know you better than that. You're stressing about something. Jamal hesitated, then said, "It's just people. They're talking about us, about how we're fixing the house and all." Malik raised an eyebrow. "So what? Let them talk. You're doing something good, and they're just mad it's not them." "It's not that simple," Jamal said, his voice low. "It never is," Malik replied, leaning back on the steps. "But you can't let them get in your head. If I did that, I'd never get off my porch." Jamal chuckled despite himself. "Yeah, maybe you're right." "Of course I'm right," Malik said, grinning. "Now come on, let's hit the lot before it gets dark." The empty lot had always been a refuge for Jamal and his friends. That night, it was filled with laughter and the thud of their deflated soccer ball. For a few hours, Jamal forgot about the whispers, the rent increase, and the strange tension in the air. But as they walked home, the shadows of the neighborhood seemed darker than usual. Jamal's stomach tightened when he saw a black car parked a few houses down from his own. "Isn't that the car from before?" Malik asked, his voice cautious. Jamal nodded, his pulse quickening. The car's sleek design stood out starkly against the worn-down homes. He thought about Connor's last visit and wondered if he had returned. When Jamal got closer, his mom stepped out onto the porch, her arms crossed. "What's going on?" she called, her voice sharp. "I don't know," Jamal replied, climbing the steps. The driver's door opened, and Connor Hargrove emerged, looking slightly disheveled. His usual composed demeanor was replaced by something more urgent. "Miss Carter," Connor began, his tone apologetic, "I'm sorry to show up unannounced again. But my father, he's not well. He's been asking for Jamal." Lydia's eyes narrowed. "What does he want with my son?" Connor hesitated. He wants to see him, to thank him properly." Lydia's jaw tightened. "He already thanked us? More than enough." "I know," Connor said quickly. "But my father's health is failing, and he's made it clear this is important to him. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't." Jamal looked between Connor and his mom, his stomach churning. He didn't want to go, but the thought of refusing an old man's dying wish gnawed at him. "Ma," Jamal said quietly, "maybe I should go, just for a little while." Lydia turned to him, her eyes searching his face. After a long pause, she sighed. "If you're going, I'm coming with you." Connor nodded. "Of course. We'll leave whenever you're ready." The ride to the Hargrove estate was tense. Lydia sat with her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. Jamal glanced at her occasionally, wishing he could ease her worry. When they arrived, the house looked even more imposing than before, its white columns stark against the night sky. Walter was waiting for them in the sitting room, his frail frame seeming even smaller in the large armchair. "Jamal," Walter said, his voice rasping. "Thank you for coming." Jamal sat across from him, Lydia standing protectively nearby. "Of course, sir," Jamal said, his voice hesitant. Walter smiled faintly. "I won't keep you long. I just wanted to tell you what you did for me. That small act of kindness reminded me of something I lost a long time ago. Hope." Jamal's throat tightened. He wasn't used to people speaking to him like this, with so much sincerity. Walter gestured toward Connor, who handed Jamal a small wooden box. "Inside is something I'd like you to have. You and your family." Jamal hesitated, glancing at Lydia. She nodded reluctantly, and Jamal opened the box. Inside was a simple brass key. "What's this for?" Jamal asked, confused. Connor stepped forward. "It opens a room in the estate. My father would like you to see what's inside." Lydia's eyes narrowed. "Why? What's in there?" "Nothing dangerous, I assure you," Walter said. "Just something I no longer need. Something that might help you." Jamal and Lydia followed Connor to the room, their footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. When they reached the door, Jamal used the key to unlock it. Inside, the room was filled with shelves of antiques, paintings, sculptures, and ornate furniture. Lydia's breath caught. This is too much," she said. Walter's voice drifted from the doorway. "Take what you need. Sell it, keep it, do whatever you want. Just promise me you'll use it well." That night, as they drove home with a few carefully chosen items, Jamal felt a mixture of gratitude and unease. The Hargroves had given them a chance to change their lives, but the weight of that chance felt heavier than ever. The morning after their visit to the Hargrove estate, the Carter household felt heavier than usual. Lydia sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood as she stared at the brass key now sitting in the middle of the table. "It's too much," she muttered. Jamal sat across from her, his hands folded in his lap. "Ma, it's not like they forced it on us. Mr. Hargrove, just he wanted to help." Lydia sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Help isn't free, Jamal, and it's never this generous." Jamal wanted to argue, but he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had lingered since they left the estate. The ornate furniture, the priceless paintings, it all felt surreal, like a weight he wasn't sure he was ready to carry. "We don't have to keep it all," Jamal offered. "Maybe just sell enough to get by." Lydia nodded slowly. "We'll start small, but I don't want anyone else in the neighborhood finding out." That afternoon, Lydia called Mr. Green, the retired antique dealer who lived a few blocks away. He arrived at their house later that day, his eyes widening when he saw the items they had brought back from the estate. "These are remarkable," Mr. Green said, carefully examining a small bronze statue of a bird. "Old. Valuable." Jamal watched as Lydia sat stiffly beside Mr. Green, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "How valuable?" Lydia asked. Mr. Green hesitated, glancing at her. "Enough to make a difference." The first sale brought in more money than Jamal had ever seen at one time. Lydia used it to pay off their rent for the next few months, fix the broken floorboards in the living room, and buy a small set of tools to repair the creaking porch. It was a relief to see his mom's shoulders relax, even just a little. But the changes around the house didn't go unnoticed. Mrs. Henderson stopped by one afternoon, her tone casual, but her questions pointed. "Your house is looking nice, Lydia. Got a little extra money coming in?" Lydia smiled tightly. "Just a bit of good luck, that's all." Mrs. Henderson nodded, but the curiosity in her eyes didn't fade. As the weeks went by, the Carter family's small improvements sparked larger changes in the neighborhood. Inspired by the Carters' freshly painted house, Mrs. Johnson repainted her porch. Mr. Patel started stocking fresher produce at the corner store, and a group of neighbors organized a community cleanup day for the empty lot where the kids played soccer. But not everyone was pleased with the changes. The whispers grew louder, and some neighbors began to avoid the Carters altogether. "They think they're better than us now," someone muttered loudly enough for Jamal to hear as he walked home from school. Jamal clenched his fist but kept walking, his head down. One evening, as Jamal sat on the porch watching his siblings chase each other around the yard, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. Jamal's stomach twisted as Connor Hargrove stepped out, his expression unusually grim. "Evening, Jamal," Connor said, his tone cautious. "Is your mom home?" "Yeah," Jamal said. "Wait here." Inside, Lydia was chopping vegetables for dinner. When Jamal told her who was outside, she froze, her knife stilling mid-chop. "What does he want now?" she muttered, wiping her hands on a dish towel. When she stepped onto the porch, her posture was tense, her gaze sharp. "What is it, Mr. Hargrove?" Connor hesitated, then said, "My father passed away last night." Lydia's expression softened slightly. "I'm sorry to hear that." Connor nodded. "Before he died, he made it clear he wanted me to check in on your family, to make sure you were making good use of what he gave you." Lydia's eyes narrowed. "We're doing fine, thank you. But we don't need you coming around here unannounced." Connor's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Understood. I'll leave you to it. But if you ever need anything, you know where to find me." As Connor drove away, Lydia turned to Jamal. "No more visits," she said firmly. "Do you hear me? I don't care what they offer or what they say. We're done." Jamal nodded, but deep down, he wasn't sure if it would be that simple. The next morning, the whispers in the neighborhood reached a boiling point. As Jamal walked to the corner store, he overheard two neighbors talking near a fence. "They've got money coming in from somewhere," one said. "Probably handouts," the other replied. "And now they think they're too good for the rest of us." Jamal's chest tightened. He quickened his pace, desperate to escape their words. When he got home, Lydia was sitting on the porch steps, her hands gripping a folded letter. "What's that?" Jamal asked. "It's from Murdoch," Lydia said, her voice tight. Jamal snatched the letter from her hands and read it quickly. It was another rent increase, effective immediately. "This is ridiculous," Jamal said, crumpling the letter in his fist. "It's not fair, but it's legal," Lydia said bitterly. "And there's nothing we can do about it." The frustration in her voice was enough to make Jamal's blood boil. He wanted to fix everything, to make the whispers and the rent hikes and the tension disappear. But he didn't know how. That night, Jamal couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He thought about Walter Hargrove's words, "You reminded me of hope." And then he thought about his mom, her tired eyes and calloused hands, and how she had worked herself to the bone to keep their family afloat. Something had to change. The next morning, Jamal woke to the sound of hammering. For a moment, he thought it was coming from a neighbor's house, but then he realized it was closer, right outside their home. He jumped out of bed, threw on a t-shirt, and ran to the porch. Lydia was there, a determined look on her face as she repaired the loose railing with a borrowed hammer and nails. "Ma," Jamal said, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "What are you doing? What does it look like?" Lydia replied without looking up. "This railing's been wobbling for months. It's time we fixed it." Jamal hesitated. His mom's tone wasn't angry, but it was firm, almost defiant. "Let me help," he said, stepping forward. Lydia handed him the hammer, her expression softening. "Good. Start with that corner." They worked side by side all morning, replacing loose boards and repainting the porch. As the sun climbed higher, Emmett and Sophia joined them, eagerly fetching nails and holding the paintbrushes. The small project turned into a family effort, and for a few hours, it felt like the tension that had gripped their home had eased. When they finished, the porch gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. Lydia stepped back to admire their work, her hands on her hips. "It's not perfect," she said, "but it's ours." Jamal nodded, a rare smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, it looks good, Ma." Later that day, as Jamal walked to the corner store, he felt a sense of pride he hadn't felt in weeks. But that pride was quickly dampened when he overheard more whispers from the neighbors. "They're fixing up their place like they're moving to the suburbs or something," one voice said. "Probably think they're too good for the rest of us," another added. Jamal clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. He wanted to shout at them, to tell them they were wrong. But instead, he kept walking, his head down. The whispers followed him home, and by the time he reached the house, the pride he'd felt that morning had all but evaporated. He found Lydia in the kitchen preparing dinner, her face calm but tired. "Ma," Jamal said, sitting at the table, "why do people hate us for trying to do better?" Lydia paused, her knife hovering over a carrot. "It's not hated, baby. It's fear. People see us fixing up the house, and they think we're leaving them behind. They don't understand that we're just trying to survive." "But we haven't done anything wrong," Jamal said, his voice rising slightly. "I know," Lydia said softly, "but sometimes doing the right thing still makes people uncomfortable. All we can do is keep moving forward." That evening, as the family sat down for dinner, the doorbell rang. Jamal glanced at Lydia, who gave him a wary nod. He got up to answer the door, his stomach knotting. When he opened it, he found Connor Hargrove standing on the porch, holding a small box wrapped in brown paper. "Sorry to bother you again," Connor said, his voice quiet. "But I wanted to drop this off. It's something my father wanted you to have." Jamal frowned, stepping aside to let him in. "Ma," he called, "it's Mr. Hargrove." Lydia appeared in the doorway, her expression guarded. "What is it now?" Connor held out the box. "It's a collection of my father's journals. He wanted Jamal to have them. He thought they might inspire him." Lydia hesitated, then took the box, her brow furrowing. "Why would he think that?" Connor smiled faintly. "Because your son reminds him of the person he used to be, the person he wished he'd stayed." That night, Jamal sat in his room, flipping through the journals. The pages were filled with elegant handwriting, detailing Walter Hargrove's rise to wealth, his regrets, and his hopes for the future. One entry stood out. "Success means nothing if it doesn't lift others with you. I've spent my life building walls to protect myself, but now I see the power of building bridges instead." Jamal closed the journal, his chest tightening. He thought about his family, his neighborhood, and the tension that had been growing around them. Maybe Walter had a point. Maybe there was a way to fix things not just for his family, but for everyone. The next day, Jamal shared the journal entry with Lydia. She read it carefully, her eyes lingering on the words "building bridges." "What are you thinking, Ma?" Jamal asked. I'm thinking, Lydia said slowly, that maybe it's time we stopped hiding. Jamal frowned. What do you mean? I mean, Lydia said, setting the journal down, that if people are going to talk about us anyway, we might as well give them something worth talking about. That weekend, Lydia invited a few neighbors over for coffee. She started with Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Johnson, two women who had always been friendly despite the whispers. Jamal watched as his mom explained the truth about their situation, the Hargroves' generosity, the antiques they had sold, and their plans to use the money to help their family and the neighborhood. To Jamal's surprise, the women were understanding. Well, Mrs. Henderson said, sipping her coffee, that makes a lot more sense than the nonsense people have been saying. Mrs. Johnson nodded. You've got nothing to be ashamed of, Lydia. You're just doing what any mother would do. Their kindness gave Lydia the courage to invite more neighbors over the following week. Slowly but surely, the whispers began to fade, replaced by cautious curiosity. One day, Jamal and Malik were playing soccer in the empty lot when Mrs. Henderson approached with a group of kids. Thought I'd bring these little ones to join you, she said with a smile. They need something to do, and this lot's as good a place as any. Jamal and Malik quickly set up makeshift teams, the lot ringing with laughter and shouts as they played. As the game ended, Mrs. Johnson appeared with a basket of sandwiches. Thought you boys might be hungry, she said. Thanks, Mrs. Johnson, Jamal called, his grin wide. Malik nudged him. See? Told you people would come around. By the end of the month, the neighborhood felt different. The empty lot had become a gathering place, and neighbors started pitching in to improve it. Someone donated wooden planks for benches, while another family brought paint to brighten the goalposts. For the first time in years, the community felt united. And Jamal, standing in the middle of it all, realized that Walter Hargrove's words had been right. Bridges were stronger than walls. Jamal stood on the freshly painted porch, watching the neighborhood come alive in ways he hadn't seen in years. Kids ran laughing through the streets, their shouts mixing with the distant hum of lawnmowers and the clinking of tools. Across the street, Mrs. Johnson was planting flowers along her fence line, her wide-brimmed hat shielding her from the sun. Looks different, doesn't it? Malik said, appearing beside him. Yeah, Jamal replied, a small smile tugging at his lips. It does. The transformation of the neighborhood hadn't happened overnight, but it felt like it had gained momentum ever since the community cleanup day at the empty lot. Now dubbed Hargrove Field, the once barren patch of dirt had been turned into a modest soccer field, complete with sturdy goalposts and freshly painted boundary lines. The name had been Malik's idea, and it had quickly caught on. It's fitting, he had said with a shrug. He's the guy who started all this, right? Jamal couldn't argue with that. At home, Lydia had been keeping busy. With the help of Mr. Green, she had continued selling some of the antiques Walter Hargrove had given them, but she was careful not to overextend or draw too much attention. Most of the money went toward practical improvements, replacing the creaky stairs, repairing the broken fence, and stocking the pantry with more than just the essentials. One afternoon, Lydia came home with a second-hand laptop for Jamal. For school, she said simply, though her eyes were shining with pride. Jamal ran his hand over the smooth surface of the laptop, his heart swelling. Thanks, Ma, he said, his voice thick. You've earned it, she replied, placing a hand on his shoulder. You've been working hard. It's time you had something to help you keep moving forward. The changes in the neighborhood weren't limited to physical improvements. The growing sense of unity had sparked a wave of generosity. Mrs. Henderson organized a weekly soccer league at Hargrove Field, bringing kids together to play while parents cheered from the sidelines. Mr. Patel started a small community bulletin board in his store, where neighbors could post about odd jobs or free items they no longer needed. Jamal found himself swept up in the energy. He volunteered at the field, helping younger kids practice their skills and organizing games. It felt good to be part of something bigger than himself, to see the ripple effect of Walter's gifts spreading throughout the community. One evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, Jamal sat on the porch with Lydia. The air was warm and still, the kind of summer evening that felt timeless. You did good, Jamal, Lydia said, her voice breaking the comfortable silence. Jamal turned to her, surprised. What do you mean? I mean all of this, Lydia said, gesturing to the neighborhood. The field, the repairs, the way people are coming together. None of it would have happened without you. Jamal looked down at his hands, his cheeks flushing. I just helped an old man with a box, Ma. Lydia smiled, shaking her head. And look what that small act of kindness turned into. Jamal thought about Walter Hargrove's journals, the way they had inspired him to believe that even small actions could lead to big changes. He wasn't sure if he deserved all the credit, but hearing his mom's words made him feel proud. That weekend, the neighborhood hosted a celebration at Hargrove Field. It was simple, just food, music, and laughter, but it felt like a turning point. Families brought homemade dishes to share, and someone set up speakers to play music. Jamal spent most of the evening running around with the younger kids, their laughter ringing out as they chased after the soccer ball. But as the night wore on, he found himself standing on the sidelines, watching the scene unfold. You should say something, Malik said, nudging him. What? Jamal asked, startled. Come on, man. This is your moment. Before Jamal could protest, Malik was already calling for everyone's attention. Hey, everyone, Jamal's got something to say. Jamal felt his stomach flip as dozens of eyes turned toward him. He glanced at Lydia, who gave him an encouraging nod and stepped forward, his heart pounding. Hey, he began, his voice shaky. I just wanted to say thank you to all of you for helping make this neighborhood what it is now. When I helped Mr. Hargrove that day, I didn't think it would lead to anything like this. But it did. And it's not just because of me, it's because of all of us. We've been through a lot, but we're still here, and we're stronger together. The crowd erupted into applause, and Jamal felt a wave of relief and pride wash over him. As he stepped back, Lydia wrapped an arm around his shoulders. You did good, baby, she whispered. A few weeks after the celebration, Connor Hargrove stopped by the Carter house again. This time, he wasn't empty-handed. My father left something else for you, Connor said, setting a small box on the kitchen table. Lydia hesitated, her expression wary. What is it? Connor smiled faintly. A deed. To this house. Jamal's jaw dropped. Wait, what? Connor nodded. My father believed in giving back, and he wanted to make sure you had a secure future. The house is yours now, no rent, no landlord. Just a home for your family. Lydia's hands trembled as she opened the box, her eyes scanning the paperwork inside. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Say thank you, Connor said gently. And use it well. That night, Lydia called a family meeting. As they sat around the table, she explained what the deed meant. This is a blessing, she said, her voice steady. But it's also a responsibility. We have to keep working, keep improving not just for us, but for everyone around us. Jamal nodded, feeling the weight of her words. The house was theirs, but the journey wasn't over. There was still work to be done, and he was ready to take it on. The weeks turned into months, and the Carter family settled into a new sense of normalcy. The house became a hub of activity, with neighbors stopping by to chat or borrow tools. Hargrove Field continued to thrive, becoming a symbol of the neighborhood's resilience and unity. Jamal kept busy with school and soccer, but he also found himself dreaming bigger. Inspired by Walter's journals, he started researching ways to bring more opportunities to the neighborhood after-school programs, scholarships, and job training initiatives. One evening, as he sat on the porch with Malik, he shared his vision. You think it'll work? Malik asked, raising an eyebrow. I think we can try, Jamal said with a grin. Malik grinned back. Well, if anyone can pull it off, it's you. As the sun set over the neighborhood, Jamal felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he knew they could face it together. Because in the end, it wasn't just about survival, it was about building something lasting, something that could lift everyone up. And that, Jamal realized, was the legacy Walter Hargrove had hoped for all along. The days following Connor Hargrove's final visit were surreal for the Carter family. The realization that they now owned their home, a place that had always felt temporary, brought a mixture of relief and disbelief. Lydia spent hours reading over the deed, her fingers tracing the legal language as if trying to confirm its reality. Ma, Jamal said one evening as he sat beside her at the kitchen table, why does it feel like it's still not real? Lydia looked up, her expression soft but weary. Because, baby, when you spend your whole life worrying about losing what little you have, It's hard to believe when someone finally says you can keep it. Jamal nodded, her words sinking in. He thought about Walter Hargrove's journals and the stories they told about how wealth had isolated him, how regret had pushed him to give back. The connection between their family and the Hargroves still felt unlikely, but it had sparked something that couldn't be ignored: change. The neighborhood's transformation continued. Mrs. Johnson's porch was now bright with pots of blooming flowers, and even Mrs. Hill, who had once been the loudest critic, had taken to repainting her fence. It seemed like everyone was finding ways to contribute to the small but growing sense of pride in their community. One afternoon, as Jamal walked home from the soccer field, he spotted Mr. Patel outside his store, hanging a new sign that read, "Neighborhood Hub. Resources and opportunities available here." "What's that for, Mr. Patel?" Jamal asked, pausing on the sidewalk. Mr. Patel adjusted his glasses and smiled. "People need a place to come together, to share information and ideas. I thought this might help." Jamal grinned. "That's a great idea." "Thank you," Mr. Patel said. "You and your family have inspired a lot of us, you know. Sometimes, all it takes is one spark." Jamal walked home with a renewed sense of purpose. If the neighborhood was willing to rally together, maybe there was a way to make an even bigger impact. Inspired by Mr. Patel's initiative, Jamal and Lydia decided to host a meeting at their house to discuss ways to improve the neighborhood. They spent the evening before preparing, arranging chairs in the living room, and setting out snacks. Emmett and Sophia helped by coloring signs that read, "Neighborhood Meeting Tonight," and taping them to nearby fences. When the night arrived, the living room was packed. Neighbors of all ages filled the chairs and lined the walls, their chatter creating a warm buzz of energy. Lydia stood at the front of the room, her hands clasped in front of her. She looked nervous at first, but when she spoke, her voice was steady. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "We've all seen how much this neighborhood has changed over the past few months. And I think we all know it didn't happen by accident. It happened because we decided to work together." The crowd murmured in agreement. "But there's still more we can do," Lydia continued. "We've come a long way, but we can go further if we keep building each other up." Jamal stepped forward, holding one of Walter Hargrove's journals. "I wanted to share something," he said, flipping to a marked page. "Mr. Hargrove wrote this before he passed. True success isn't measured by what you keep for yourself, but by what you give to others." The room grew quiet, the weight of the words settling over the crowd. "That's what we're trying to do," Jamal said. "We're not just fixing up houses or planting flowers. We're creating a place where everyone feels like they belong. And I think we can do even more after-school programs, community gardens, things that make life better for all of us." A round of applause broke out, and Jamal felt a surge of hope. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Lydia worked with Mr. Patel to set up a small scholarship fund for local kids, using some of the remaining money from the Hargroves' gifts. Mrs. Henderson organized a rotating schedule for parents to watch the younger children at Hargrove Field, giving them a safe place to play after school. Jamal and Malik spearheaded an effort to turn an abandoned lot into a community garden. With donations of seeds and tools from nearby businesses, they gathered volunteers to clear the land and plant vegetables. One day, as Jamal watered a row of tomato plants, Malik leaned on his shovel and grinned. "Man, can you believe this? Us, running a garden?" Jamal laughed. "I know, right? But it's pretty cool." "Yeah," Malik said, looking around at the bustling lot. "It's more than cool. It's ours." Months later, the neighborhood looked and felt like a completely different place. The houses were still modest, and the streets still showed their wear, but there was a vibrancy that hadn't been there before. Hargrove Field hosted regular soccer matches, with kids and adults alike joining in. The community garden flourished, providing fresh produce for families who needed it. And the bulletin board at Mr. Patel's store was always filled with new opportunities, job postings, free classes, and neighborhood events. Jamal stood in the middle of it all, feeling a quiet pride. He thought about how far they'd come, from the days of struggling just to get by to building something that lifted everyone up. One evening, as the sun set over the neighborhood, Lydia called the family outside. She stood on the freshly repaired porch, holding a small plaque in her hands. "What's that, Ma?" Emmett asked, squinting at the shiny brass letters. It's a reminder, Lydia said, turning the plaque toward them. The inscription read, "The Carter family home, built on kindness and community." Jamal felt a lump form in his throat as Lydia handed him the plaque. Go on, she said. Hang it up. With Malik's help, Jamal mounted the plaque beside the front door. When he stepped back to admire it, the weight of everything they had achieved hit him all at once. It's perfect, Lydia said, her voice soft. Jamal smiled, the warmth of his family's love surrounding him. That night, as Jamal lay in bed, he thought about Walter Hargrove. He thought about how a single act of kindness had changed everything for his family, for the neighborhood, and for himself. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. Because now, he understood that the greatest strength wasn't in what you had, but in what you gave. And with that thought, he drifted to sleep, the quiet hum of a hopeful neighborhood outside his window. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more inspiring, heartfelt content, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Your support means the world and helps us create more content that uplifts and connects us all. Thank you for being here.